Hello. Hi, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for joining us for a Center on American Politics discussion on COVID, conspiracy theories, and campaigns. There's been a lot of interest in this topic, and we're glad you could join us today. I want to briefly mention that the Center on American Politics here at the University of Denver has an ambitious calendar for the fall leading up until Election Day. We're going to have a discussion of Black Lives Matter activism on October 1st. We'll be helping out with a debate between U.S. Senate candidates Cory Gardner and John Hickenlooper on October 9th, and we have lots more. Please check out our website at du.edu/AmericanPolitics. That's du.edu/AmericanPolitics to get some more details. But for our discussion today, chances are, if you live in North America, you've noticed some smoke in the air lately. It's worse some places than others. There's a theory making the rounds that the recent wave of forest fires affecting the western states were started by Antifa, which is a loose collection of anti-fascist protesters. Western state law enforcement is now spending a fair amount of time and effort trying to combat some of those rumors and push back against them. And they're also dealing with groups of vigilantes that have cropped up that are patrolling the forest to keep Antifa groups away. Chances are I just made that problem worse by mentioning it here. So conspiratorial thinking seems to be a top concern among American political observers right now and others. It has the potential to undermine people's faith in American political institutions and even in this fall's election results. But we're curious just how widespread is this, how damaging is it, and what, if anything, can we do about it? To answer these questions, we've put together a really great group of scholars, both from here at the university and from some other wonderful schools. I'm going to introduce them now, and then we'll start our discussion. We have about an hour here to have really kind of drill in on some of these questions. And I will ask the participants to turn on their cameras as I get to their name. Our first person is Kimberly Chu. She's an assistant professor here at the University of Denver's Psychology Department. She's also director of the DU Motivation, Affect, and Cognition Lab. Her research focuses on how motivation and affect, which is basically what we want and how we feel, how these things shape cognitive processes, such as the way we allocate attention, control task performance, and learn new information. She's also one of the faculty affiliates with the Center on American Politics for the 2020-21 academic year. We also have with us Karim El Damanuri, who is a broadcast journalist with over a decade of media experience in the United States and the Arab world, including work as a producer at CNN International, with some PBS affiliates and multiple networks across Egypt and Jordan. He's also an assistant professor of journalism and media studies here at the University of Denver. He focuses on visual communication, on intercultural communication, and media and conflict. A lot of his recent work has focused on the use of new media and visual communication strategies by violent militant groups. We also have with us Joanne Miller, who is an associate professor in the Political Science and International Relations Department at the University of Delaware. She's a political psychologist who teaches and conducts research on public opinion, propaganda, and conspiracy theories. She's put out some very recent published work on COVID conspiracy theories, examining what these theories are and which sorts of voters are most likely to believe them. And finally, we have with us Joe Usinski, who is an associate professor of political science at the University of Miami. His research deals with public opinion and mass media, with a particular focus on conspiracy theories, misinformation, and disinformation. He's a co-author of the book American Conspiracy Theories, published by Oxford University Press in 2014. He's also an editor of the book Conspiracy Theories and the People Who Believe Them, published by Oxford in 2018. So the way this is going to work, I'm going to ask our panel a series of questions, and then we're going to turn things over to you all. If you have questions as they come into your head about conspiracies, about US politics, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to ask those questions. We will do our best to get through as many of your questions as we can in the next hour. I'll be trying to field those as they come in. Also, if you're interested, at the bottom of your screen, there is a chat button. If you would like to chat with each other, if you would like to sort of get to know each other, start a little side conversation, we encourage that. I encourage you to identify yourself by your name and where you're writing from, and feel free to just reach out to other people there. But again, if you want to ask a question for us on this panel, please use the Q&A button down at the bottom. Okay, So thank you to all for joining us today. I'm going to start off with the first question, and this is really directed to the whole panel. So this year's election cycle seems unusually focused on conspiracy theories. There are several congressional candidates that are openly spouting QAnon ideas. There are people spreading rumors that there's efforts to use a potential COVID vaccine to control the population. The president of the United States is claiming there's a massive effort to rig the election results and so forth. So first of all, I guess my question for the panel is that historically correct? Like, is this really an unusual year for conspiracy theories, or are they actually regularly a part of American elections? And if they are unusual this year, what is it about this year? Is it because of President Trump? Is it because of the virus? Is it because of the economy? So really, anyone who want to jump in on that question? Joanne, I think I saw you nodding. Okay.
I was going to say, Joe can take this one to start with, but I can, well, go ahead.
Joe, we can't hear you.
Joe, we can't hear you.
There you go. Okay. So what I would say is there are conspiracy theories in every election. That's nothing new and nothing out of the ordinary. It seems like there's more now. And I would certainly agree with that. And I think the reasons for that are largely due to Trump. We have a president, unlike other recent presidents, who engages in lots and lots of conspiratorial rhetoric. He uses conspiracy theories regularly to motivate his core supporters. He did it in 2016 and the lead up to his victory there, and he's continued to do it while he's been in office. That has pushed the media to have to focus on conspiracy theories as well, because this is now a big part of the rhetoric coming from our political elites. Now journalists have to cover it. Just to give an example of this, I've been running a Google alert on the term conspiracy theory since 2011. In 2011, 2012, I used to get back 5 or 6 stories written by journalists that had the term conspiracy theory in it. In recent years, I get about 100 stories a day, every single day about this. So the media is clearly paying attention, and it's very much something that we're focusing on. But that is somewhat different than saying people are believing it more or they're more influential than they have been in the past. Much of this, I just think, is Trump and media's reaction to Trump.
Yeah, I think I would just amplify that last thing that Joe mentioned, is that just because we're seeing more of them and the media are covering them more doesn't mean more people are believing now than ever did before. And so I think it's important to separate out those two pieces, that exposure, media having to cover this more because it's what the president is saying, and the media covers what the president says. And so we're seeing it more, they're being shared more because they're part of ordinary, now everyday media stories. Doesn't necessarily mean that belief is higher now than it ever was before.
And just to jump in and add to that with regards to the media's coverage. So us journalists, when we're working, we are guided by the newsworthiness of the event or the quote that is being told. And one of the news values is prominence. Who is actually, propagating that conspiracy theory? So of course, when we find, like Q signs in Trump rallies, for example, or Trump gets asked something about QAnon and then, he responds to it, or he doesn't dismiss the conspiracy theory, that makes it really newsworthy. And thus that explains also the fact that the media jumps to that and covers that because it's new.
I think it's also worth noting, this is being driven by activity from the top down, but also this year has been characterized by a lot of uncertainty for a lot of people economically and with the pandemic. And so it's potentially, you could think of that as potentially a more fertile environment for theories that help people make sense of things around them as well, which is, compounded with all of these other factors at play.
So people aren't crazy to think this is kind of a weird year, right? Just it's not typical. So I have a next question. I really want to go to Joe Sinski specifically for this, but others should feel free to jump in. I was hoping you could sort of elaborate on what some of the major conspiracy theories that are out there right now that are being promoted and discussed this cycle. Just give us a sense of what's out there, who's pushing it, what are we dealing with? Ooh, I think you're muted again.
Muted, Joe.
Sorry. What's so interesting is that they seem to come and go so quickly right now that each time there's a new conspiracy theory that pops up on Twitter or journalists start covering it, it's here and gone. And then there's the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. So it doesn't seem to me that there is a overarching narrative. I mean, even the ideas that I thought would have had a little more staying power, like ideas about the postal service, withholding the delivery of ballots for some reason, that there was going to be a conspiracy behind that. That hasn't really, that was a flash in the pan for a week or two. I'll be polling on it next week, but I don't really expect that to be a really major thing. Instead, what I would say is, instead of focusing on the specifics of the theories, I think what's more important is to focus on the people who are very prone to buying into the vast lot of these ideas. So I like to say everybody believes in a conspiracy theory. Most people probably believe in a few, but there are some people who believe in a lot, and they believe in almost everyone that they run into. And it's those people that seem to be driving a lot of the internet traffic on it. And they're the people who are sort of driving each new conspiracy theory, if we can call them that. And that's where I think some of the media attention is, on these more extreme types of people. Whereas your average mom and pop sitting around the dinner table aren't, they're not looking at a Wayfair furniture website thinking there's children being delivered in it. I mean, that's a small number of people that buy into those things.
Yeah, actually, let me go over to Joanne on this, just because I know you've done some research on this recently. Can you give us an idea of who are the kinds of people, who are the kinds of voters who are most likely to embrace conspiracy theories? Is this about partisanship? Is this about people's economic situation or their age? And relatedly, if you could add to that, when voters believe these things, is this just a matter that they believe them, or do they actually cast a vote based on those decisions? Does this actually affect the way they behave politically?
Sure. So I'll take the first question. First, on the demographics, the short answer is there aren't that many demographic characteristics that generally predict conspiracy beliefs. So there's not a huge effect of age. And I'm talking more generally here. Very specific conspiracy theories may pop up for a certain demographic as being more likely to be believed. But in general, the one that we do see is education. People with lower education tend to be more conspiratorial. But that's the demographic that's the most characteristic. The stronger sort of predictors are individuals who, for example, are just generally have more of a conspiratorial mindset. So people who just tend to see the world in terms of conspiracy theories, tend to go to conspiratorial explanations for events, are more likely to see conspiracies in any one specific event. And this kind of tends to be more of a relatively stable characteristic that distinguishes people, is this whether they are more higher in this conspiratorial mindset. The other factor is situational. So as Kimberly was saying, when during situations that are more uncertain, when people feel like they're powerless or they have a loss of control, they'll tend to seek out, we all tend to seek out explanations for surprising events. But in particular, when they're scary and we're powerless and we're uncertain, we try to explain events, because when we explain them, we can understand our world and predict and act and behave in our world more effectively. And so when we are more uncertain, we tend to connect dots that shouldn't be connected in a seeking out explanation kind of mode. Last quick thing on partisanship. In general, I don't see a standard general effect of partisanship on conspiratorial thinking. Some conspiracy theories are more likely to be believed by Democrats. Other conspiracy theories are more likely to be believed by Republicans. But I don't see it consistent in general across the board. One party is more likely to believe than others. On the vote thing, it's kind of the same thing as in general, there's no partisanship effect. Believing, it depends on the conspiracy theory. Conspiratorial thinking in general doesn't lead one to be more likely to vote for Democrats or Republicans. But if you believe a conspiracy theory about the current president, you might be less likely to vote for that person. But it's just like any other attitude that you might have about that person.
We got in a question from someone watching related to this question. Are there biological factors that can affect whether someone has a conspiratorial mindset? Their amygdala size, their gender, something like that?
Yeah, so Joe, do you want to jump in?
I haven't seen strong evidence of that, but there are arguments out there that say that it is an evolutionary trait. So you can imagine this idea that if you were a person, 30, 40,000 years ago walking through, across the plains and you see a brush and you hear a rustle, you can assume that it's a tiger about to eat you, or you can assume it's the wind. And if you wrongly assume it's the tiger and it's just the wind, you're okay. But if you wrongly assume it's the wind and it's the tiger, you get eaten. So there may be something evolutionary to the idea that, as our ancestors were more wary of potential threats, they may have been the ones more likely to live on. But now I think that may be the opposite. Now, cooperation, particularly in a time like this, is so important that people who are wary of outsiders and dangers, to the point where they might not want to take a vaccine or engage in social distancing or something like that, they're the ones who are going to be bearing the burden of their decisions.
That's an interesting way to think of it. Kimberly, some of this touched on what you were talking about before. I was hoping you could give us a little bit of an idea about basically the emotional mood of the electorate. I know some of your recent research is focusing on that, and then you've got some ongoing work focusing on how people are thinking about the election and how they'll be processing the election day itself.
Right.
Can you give us an idea of, just sort of where the electorate is this year? How maybe they might be different from in other years? Does this make them, more or less conspiratorial?
Right. So I guess I just really wanted to follow up on what Joe said quickly, that we can think about responding to threats as something that's been evolutionarily advantageous, and also just the propensity for people to see patterns in things, like this tendency to recognize patterns and to ascribe causes is something that our brains are really good at doing, and a lot of the time that's been useful in survival. But you can also think of those tendencies as potentially driving us to connect the dots in a way, as Joanne said, in a way that might not necessarily be accurate or lead to cooperative behavior and so on. And as I said earlier, I think it's been a year that's characterized for a lot of people by stress and uncertainty on a number of different fronts, with political situation, the economic situation, the pandemic situation. And so I think that mix of things is going to lead to some pretty high emotions for people. Seth, I know you recently published your book on the Democrats following 2016, and I think that the outcome of the 2016 election was also a surprise to a lot of Democrats. At least that's what our data from the 2016 election evidenced. And so I think the mood going into this is there's a lot of emotions that people are bringing into this situation. There's some evidence that people are more prone to buy into conspiracy theories when they're not necessarily thinking analytically. So Joanne noted this mindset, but also if you sort of have an analytical mindset, you can see the holes in the logic. And with a lot of stress and uncertainty, people might be less prone to do that. So that's also something that we can think about going into November.
Yeah, thank you, by the way, for mentioning my book. I did not pay her to do that at all. I really appreciate that. But, you know, related to that, we often see, you know, particularly the losing side in an election. There are, you know, when, you know, basically diehard activists try to explain why they lost, sometimes conspiratorial thinking comes in there. We saw that in 2004. A number of Democrats had sort of pushed the theory that there was something funny going on in Ohio, that, you know, those votes weren't rightly won. You know, and we've certainly heard that after 2016. Even President Trump was claiming there were conspiracies against him, even though he won. So, you know, that's obviously something, you know, even after an election, we can be prone to this kind of thinking, and it can be a little risky. I'd actually like to jump over to Kareem on a question, but, you know, others should feel free to jump in on this, is basically, what can we do about this? Kareem, I know you have some experience with this as, you know, in your work in media as a CNN contributor and producer. What is the role for journalists? What is the role for educators in limiting the spread of conspiracy theories, or for inoculating voters against them? Are there things we can do? Can we even play this kind of a role?
Yeah, so I'll start with the journalist role, and let me first start by saying that if you asked journalists, you know, what is the best practices to dealing with conspiracy theory, odds are they're not necessarily going to come to a consensus on that, on how to, you know, deal with that. However, one of the things that is really important, and this also touches on Karen's question in the Q&A section, is the notion of nuance and context. Am I putting things in context when I'm reporting on it, and when I'm writing scripts, and when I'm, you know, on the screen telling stories, the deeper dives that Karen touched on. So I remember, probably many of you may know that Jair Bolsonaro, the Brazilian president, was infected by COVID-19 not so long ago. And throughout his 2-week quarantine in the presidential palace in Brasilia, he was always talking about how chloroquine has worked for him, and that it's, you know, doing great. However, the CDC of Brazil was talking about how chloroquine is not proven to, you know, treat you know, COVID-19 in any way, shape, or form. And I had to grapple with that when I was writing the script, because at the end of the day, it is an important quote and a soundbite when he says that chloroquine works. But then I have, as a journalist, to put that in context, and I had to pull, you know, from, as I said, the CDC of Brazil and other, you know, the FDA here in the US, and what's their take on chloroquine when it comes to COVID-19. The other thing is the types of questions that are being asked. So if many of you may also remember that President Trump was asked in one of the press briefings, what do you think of QAnon? You cannot just ask a question like this. This is I mean, this is just a softball that is just offering, you know, free publicity to Trump to, you know, actually add to more conspiratorial thinking through his answers, right? Another way of asking the very same question is just leading in with, you know, facts that FBI was saying that this could actually, you know, lead to hurt the American society, you know? So focusing on certain facts that are important. The other thing also that often happens in the media, and I personally, I'm not on board with, is the notion of labeling. That when you're talking about something like this, you know, you start saying stuff like lunatic or bizarre or weird or stuff like that, rather than tackling things head on and just, you know, presenting facts to the viewer. So those are some of the things on the journalism side. As far as the education side, in the courses that I teach in the context of journalism, I always try to focus on media literacy. Some people say it works, some people say it doesn't work. I like to focus on media literacy nonetheless. How is the story being framed? And even if it's not a story, how to verify a social media post. Is it just to be taken as a fact, or I need to do, you know, some cross-referencing and acquiring the skills in order to verify anything that I'm being bombarded with in social media, which is a lot these days.
Good points. Thank you for that. Those are. Do others here have opinions on basically what what the best strategies are to how to cover conspiratorial politicians who espouse conspiratorial ideas? I mean, should we be trying not to talk about them, or should we be asking? As Kareem pointed out, that should we be asking questions in much more specific ways so that we don't amplify their views? How do we cover without amplifying?
I think one thing that has happened is because of Trump and politicians like him who routinely engage in conspiracy theories and other forms of misinformation, it's really tested the media. And just to bring up one example, during 2016, prior to winning the Republican nomination, Donald Trump said to Fox News that he believed something to the effect of that Ted Cruz's father had taken part in the assassination of JFK in 1963. The Washington Post ran an article the next day with a headline saying something to the effect of, "How do we even cover this?" So they didn't know how to do it. And I think what Kareem is alluding to is that, on the one hand, politicians say things, and it's the job of reporters to report what politicians say. On the other hand, elites have a lot of power. Their words carry a lot of weight with people, and simply putting out there things that politicians say without any context can be particularly dangerous, and that it can very much amplify some of these, some of these more dangerous ideas. And we've seen this over and over again, whether it's chloroquine or spraying yourself with Lysol or zapping yourself with UV lights. So we've had people go to the hospital and even die because they've taken medical advice from leaders who should not be giving medical advice. And this brings up an old problem, is that oftentimes we're blaming social media for the spread of conspiracy theories, but our bigger problem right now is that we have a lot of elites who engage in it, and they use the traditional media to spread these ideas. And we have to, I don't think we have the perfect answer yet, but journalists are going to have to continue, particularly if Trump wins, to figure out how to blunt the effect of the things that he says.
Yeah, I want to add a couple of things. One, to Kareem's point about labeling, I would add a label that I don't use and I shy away from, and I try to encourage journalists to shy away from as well, which is conspiracy theorist, right? I don't use that word or that phrase to label people, because it cuts off any conversation right away once you label somebody as a conspiracy theorist because of the negative connotation, rightly or wrongly. I would say also on the covering, there are two pieces here. One is to cover what prominent people are saying, right? And we don't cover everything that prominent people say, right? There's not enough coverage. So there are already choices being made about what speeches to cover, what parts of the speeches to amplify, and what parts of those speeches to not amplify. And I would encourage us to think more about what parts of these speeches or what content helps people decide who to vote for better, say in the context of an election. What is useful information when it comes to helping to figure out what policies this person believes in, how they're going to represent me sort of in a pretty instrumental kind of way, and figuring that out. And I would say that knowing that Trump hinted about Ted Cruz's father, wasn't there also one about the Zodiac killer? Was it also Ted Cruz's father was also the Zodiac?
No, it's Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz was the Zodiac killer.
Ted Cruz was a Zodiac killer, and his father was involved in, yes. So that may be kind of, maybe interesting or funny information to cover, but may not be as policy relevant, maybe as and the other thing that I would say though too is that there's other side of this too, which is how can the media try to correct conspiracy theories, and part of the tricky part of this is that we know that just amplifying the conspiracy theory itself the more, it's something called perceptual fluency, the more quickly something comes to mind, the more likely we are to believe it's true. It's just sort of this heuristic that we use on just an everyday basis. And so how do you correct something without amplifying it is something that we as social scientists are working on, trying to figure out ways to do this, but also journalists have to grapple with, you know, what does the headline say? Recognizing that people don't very much go past the headline. Not Trump said this, but you know, Trump, this is wrong, or you know, what is the first thing that gets amplified? I think is important to think about as well.
I think, you know, related to what you're saying, you know, we're sometimes expecting the media and educators to like fix this, but there are some conspiracies that actually exist. Right. You know, President Lincoln was actually assassinated as part of a mass conspiracy to topple the federal government. The Tuskegee experiments, if you were to explain to someone who had never heard of them, that would sound insane. That really happened. By the way, the mail really did slow down this year. You know, we can argue about the purposes behind it or how much of that was intentional. That really did happen. So, you know, I think it's probably harder to sort of sort through, you know, what really is people conspiring to make something happen, as opposed to we're just going out there with our pattern recognition and ascribing some malevolent intent to the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the important thing here is, and now I just lost what I was going to say about, just gone completely. Oh yeah, that we sometimes think we want people in a democracy to question their government, right? That's what representation is all about. We want people to ask questions, and if people aren't representing, if our elected officials aren't representing us the way we want to be represented, then to not vote for them the next time. And so there is a fine line here. Some would argue that it's not the people who believe conspiracy theories who we should be studying. It's like they're not the weirdos. It's the people who believe everything, right? That are the weirdos, and maybe we should be studying them instead of people who question. And when you question, sometimes you'll come up with the conspiracy theory as a potential answer, or you may very well deny an authoritative account of an event because you're questioning and asking, is this really true?
And just to add to that as well, this brings another dilemma with regards to the business model of media outlets, right? Mm-hmm. So if the media is trying to get eyeballs on, you know, the TV or the articles, or I mean, whether we like it or not, we get into meetings and we are being judged by hits, by views, by clicks. So this is a fact for the, you know, for businesses, news businesses or news networks that run on, you know, advertisements and stuff. Well, it's a different case when you start looking at NPR or when you start, you know, looking at other public media, but also there is the consideration of, okay, if it's the, I don't know, like the North Korean state media, is it reporting things in a balanced way? Not really, right? So it's the notion of also, I think, to what Seth was saying, that it's not just educators and journalists, that we also need to question what is the source, what is the political leaning of the source, and how are they framing things? Joanne mentioned earlier headlines, and I often see headlines in some news outlets. I don't want to name, you know, names, but if you say something like, back to the example of Jair Bolsonaro, if I say Jair Bolsonaro, chloroquine works, and I just leave that headline at that, then I'm definitely, you know, amplifying that view. I'm definitely propagating false ideas, right? So the notion of how also you select, because selection is happening nonetheless. I'm selecting words in the headline. I'm selecting which sentence to or which quote from the speech that I'm going to lead with. I'm also selecting the images that I'm putting in my, you know, article or my TV piece or video piece, right? So selection is happening nonetheless, and we need to keep that in mind, the background of the media outlet, in order to be able to sift through ideas even from traditional media.
So thank you for all this. I want to get to some of our questions that people have been sending in. And again, if you do have a question for our panel, please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. There's a question here from a longtime fan of the center. Hi, Mom. Were there many conspiracies during Obama's term? You know, and you know, just to say that this is not all a Trump era thing. Obviously, there was the birther conspiracy, this idea that he was not a, you know, truly born within the United States, that there was somehow fraud propagated with his birth certificate. I'm trying to remember some other prominent theories that came up during his presidency.
So there was the birther idea that he faked his birth certificate, that he was a secret Muslim, a secret communist, that he killed the kids at Sandy Hook, that he had blown up the well at the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf. So almost anything that he did, there was going to be some conspiracy theory attached to it by some group of people.
There was the Jade Helm. The Jade Helm one, that the military operation in Texas was a some sort of coup, or, you know. And
the people who buy into that stuff continue to do so to this day. So polling on birtherism was around 25% of the American public in 2008, 2009, 2010. And even after the release of the birth certificate, it stayed stable. And I polled on this summer, and you're still looking at 20 some odd % thinking that the birth certificate was faked.
Right, they don't just go away when the president is no longer president. Can I jump in here, Seth? Because I saw someone pop in the chat and with a question about once you think two things are connected, it's hard to break that connection. And so how do we talk about these things? How do we try to debunk them without making the connection? And I think we've already talked a little bit about how hard that is to do, because what happens is once we make that connection in our brains between A and B, we can build a whole story around it. And that's kind of what conspiracy theories do, right? There are lots of tentacles to some of these really intricate conspiracy theories like QAnon. And just trying to attack one piece of it doesn't break down the whole. It doesn't kill the whole edifice, because there are so many connections, and that we build more connections in our brains. This is the way things work. And now we've connected dots in our own brains that maybe a journalist or someone or you may try to dispel a friend from believing something, but they're like 3 steps beyond A and B. Now they're at C, D, and E, and you don't even know where they've gone with it. And so I think I think that this underscores how hard it is to debunk or dispel a conspiracy theory once it's out there, especially on a sort of one-to-one basis with a friend or a family member. And it's I would say that we're looking in the wrong place here, that because we know that, like Joe said, and what Kimberly said, that people who tend to believe one tend to believe other conspiracy theories. And because one of the reasons for these is sort of situational uncertainty, right? If the uncertainty that gives rise to the seeking out a conspiracy theory as an explanation still exists, then even if I debunk that one conspiracy theory, there's always another one waiting in the wings, right? There's always another one that if I still feel uncertain, then I'm still gonna seek out a way to be not uncertain. And so I think that for me, it's more about trying to prevent these things from spreading in the first place. But that doesn't still make it the case that someone's not going to just make one up in their head, right? And then throw it out there. So it's trying to tackle the reasons why people are seeking out these explanations in the first place, which are big systemic questions about trust and transparency and uncertainty that are also really hard questions to tackle.
Yeah. Sorry. I also wanted to just add on to Joanne's point that, you know, if you have somebody who's already buying into a number of conspiracy theories, there's a principle called cognitive dissonance. People do not like the feeling that they were wrong. And so the idea of mentally backtracking on an idea that you've bought into is mentally uncomfortable for people. I think Joanne made a really good point when she said that you want to be careful about how you label people, because already when you put them on the defensive by labeling them as a conspiracy theorist, you effectively shut down the conversation. And when people believe something, they tend to seek out continued confirmation for that belief. So it's difficult to debunk someone's beliefs once they're established. I think she's correct in saying we want to think about what's driving these to begin with, but also if you're trying to have a conversation with someone about that, there's a real difficulty in getting people to basically accept that they might have been mistaken.
Mm. So, related to this, we've gotten a question here from Tiffany, who writes, when learning about a theory as a layperson, I can find facts online to support almost anything. I do not have the time to truly investigate all sides, so I have trouble arguing against some of these theories when those folks have facts that I can't specifically dispute. I'm a physician, so I'm better armed to argue anything medical, but outside of that, I'm really out of my depth. How do we sort this sort of thing out? There's a kind of practical advice for people here.
So I don't think we need to get into arguments with people over facts and whatnot. And I use a very simple decision rule that I tell people. That is that when a majority of experts in a particular area agree that something's true, then I'll believe it. Because there's no point in getting two people who don't know anything about a topic arguing about a bunch of facts they found on Google about that topic, because they don't know anything about it. They don't know how to interpret those facts. And let's face it, all of us are very limited in what we know about the world. I can tell you about conspiracy theories, and I really can't tell you much about anything else. I'm not going to repair my car. I can't do the plumbing in the house. And, if the lawnmower breaks, I'm not doing it. So we have to realize our own limits in our knowledge and say we are all experts in something or a few things, but outside of that, we really ought to lean on the experts in that field and give deference to them, just like they should give deference to us in whatever we're an expert in.
Yeah, I think that's actually an interesting analogy in the sense that we have no problem ceding authority to our mechanic, right? Or to our plumber, and if the plumber says X, Y, and Z is wrong, and this is how we fix it, we will typically say yes. Because if we went to go Google it, we wouldn't know what to search on and how to find it anyway. But it's interesting in these kind of discourses that we all seem to then become an authority on a particular conspiracy theory or and that we do cede authority to experts in other domains. And I think we need to ask ourselves, why aren't we ceding authority, expertise in this domain, and why shouldn't we?
I think I might actually push back a little on that, because I feel like I always hear from people who are just like, who just sort of just dismiss, but just go on to say, okay, well, the whole auto repair thing is a racket, but I have no choice, but I have to pay into that once in a while. I was like, that's how they get you. They because they know I don't know my car, so they're out to screw me somehow, which is sort of
true. But you still don't fix your car. You still pay them to fix it.
Yes,
right.
I do.
You still don't. I mean, you still don't say they're out to screw me, so I'm going to go do it myself. Right.
I'm not that far gone. Right.
Yeah. I mean, the answer to a bad expert is more and better experts, not more and better conspiracy theorists.
Right.
Right. And even if we think the experts have gotten it wrong by accident or are corrupt, then we want them to be corrected by other better experts, not by random people on the street. I mean, I'm reminded of this conversation that took place on Oprah a couple of decades ago with Jenny McCarthy, who was talking about the supposed dangers of vaccines. And Oprah said something, you know, how did you learn all this? And she said, I went to the University of Google. And that's not a good university to go to, because it allows you, just like the question, the person asking the question here said, is you can find anything to support anything. So if you're inclined to find a particular answer, it's there for you. But that's no good way to get to the truth.
And just to add to that from the media side of things, Professor, I think in University of Washington did an experiment where she had like a blank YouTube account with no search history. And then she started going to ABC, and then four clicks later, she was actually, because of the algorithms, she was actually she was watching a video about a conspiracy propagated by a neo-Nazi group, right? So with that being said, I think one other thing that we need to keep in mind when we're searching for things in the University of Google is basically to, you know, the fact that it looks fancy as a website and it looks like, you know, professional website is not actually an indication that it is true. And it's not an indication that experts back up what is being said in there. There is a whole industry of fake news websites with being run by teenagers even, who, you know, just make over $100,000 a year. In Macedonia, for example, that was a thing a while back, and they were just running fake websites and making a lot of money and just propagating ridiculous things that just gets a lot of shares, likes, loves, etc., retweets, etc. So the fact that it's getting currency on the online platforms is not an indication that this is true. So what can we do instead? What we can do is actually make sure, you know, by cross-referencing, is that fact being, you know, mentioned in reputable sources across the board that I know of, like sources that I do know of and I've heard about before, or is it just being, you know, coolboy.com or something like that, you know what I mean? So just making sure that it's being cross-referenced and it's not just something out of the blue that is being shared in my Facebook social network and has a lot of likes, and then I go and believe that. So
this is if I can just add to what Kareem said, this is complicated because remembering the source of something is also a little bit more difficult than remembering the actual information itself. And so I think that becomes a big issue when we have online sources of information, and you can find a web page that supports whatever argument you might want to make. There have been some recent studies on misinformation and showing that you know, people's memory for where they actually found a piece of information can be poor. And if they can't necessarily remember where the information came from, that might be related to their propensity to buy into it. So I don't have a solution for the fact that there are tons of information sources online, but at least being aware of the fact that we have this tendency might help people to evaluate what they remember reading with a more critical eye, and, you know, go back to, where did I hear that? What are the sources saying that I think are reputable, and so on.
Thanks. So we had a question from Marcia that was specifically about Trump's supporters. And I know we've talked a little bit about, you know, whether there's a party divide and other aspects of conspiratorial thinking, but this was a question about, you know, whether Trump supporters are atypically cult-like. That is, are Trump supporters more likely to simply believe whatever Trump says than, say, Obama's supporters were likely to believe whatever he said, or George W. Bush's fans were likely to believe what he said? Is there something particular to this president and his supporters that's that fuels this?
So I will try to, so the short answer is, logically, I'm going to say no, because most of these Trump supporters were Bush supporters. And so they're the same people. Now, whether, and so I would say, I don't have any direct evidence of this, but I wouldn't say that they're any more cult-like than supporters of any president. I mean, we tend to take off of experts and politicians, in this case, politicians that we approve of. Now, one potential difference here is certainly that since Trump became president, he's kind of governed as a loser, right? He's governed as everybody's out to get me, everybody's out to get us. I really did win the popular vote. The 3 million votes were fraudulent, dead people, illegal immigrants, and so forth, who shouldn't have voted. And so to the extent that he has created this kind of more insular group than maybe other partisans have, Joe's nodding, I'm kind of getting in, I'm talking my way into an answer here that maybe makes sense, that to that extent, maybe they are more likely to follow what he says. But I don't know. I mean,
every president's going to have their core supporters, and they all have a lot of influence. I think Trump's appeal to his core support is a little bit different. And I mean, you could imagine, why did Republicans like George W. Bush or like John McCain or Mitt Romney? It's because they were the candidate of the party at that time, and they found reasons to justify that. I think for Trump, the appeal is a little more guttural. I mean, there were things that Trump was chasing in supporters that were very different than just ideological or party cues. I mean, he was taking on a sense of status threat. There's people out to get us, and things are changing in a way we don't like. And he was going to break all of these social mores in a way that comforted a lot of people and perhaps would return us to a time, of the 1950s where things were better. And so I think he struck an emotional chord with some, and maybe a form of nostalgia. And I think for other people, the conspiracy rhetoric and they're out to get us rhetoric has really rung true for people who have that worldview, who may be more likely to view politics as less as a battle between left and right elites and more as a battle between it's us against this big corrupt establishment. And Trump is our guy helping us in that battle. And Trump certainly helps that. I mean, he says in some interviews directly, that he's fighting the deep state. Mm-hmm. I mean, what president says that? It's sort of, this is a very unique thing, and it's designed to appeal to people who view politics as that sort of battle.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add about the deep state that in some other countries that is definitely like the norm to be mentioned. But yeah, so just to add to that studies in the area of political communication, and it's not necessarily about conspiracy theories per se, but they find that the notion of selective exposure and selective avoidance, the selective exposure that you select what you tend to expose yourself to. So Republicans perhaps are more likely to watch Fox, whereas Democrats more likely to watch MSNBC, for example. So research finds that across the board, people tend to selectively expose things to media outlets that do, align with their political views. However, when it comes to selective avoidance, there's sort of like a rift where they say that Republicans tend to avoid news outlets that, propagate views different from their own, more so than Democrats. I'm not saying that means they would accept conspiracy theories or blindly follow conspiracy theories more, but definitely the notion of selective exposure and avoidance plays into the notion of an echo chamber as well, which can influence those.
That's really good. I'm thinking, and I'm trying to get at this question, just thinking back in terms of public opinion, and this doesn't exactly get at the question, but if you look at the questions about, like, do you approve of the job the president is doing? Going back historically to, the 1950s, members of the president's own party almost always have very high approval ratings for the president. It's usually in around between 80 and 90%. Regardless of how they're doing overall in the population, regardless of, how popular those presidents look historically. And, people are inclined to believe the things that the president of their party says. It just happens to be most of those presidents don't, spout things that we would call conspiratorial thinking. Like, if Bill Clinton had said, you know, he closed a speech by just saying, oh, robots are stealing my luggage, there's probably some core of Democrats who was like, you know what, robots are stealing our luggage. But we just don't see a test of that for the most part historically. So yeah, that's the way this might be unusual.
Yeah, can I just piggyback on that for a second and say that I think that this comes down to this question that those of us in the social sciences and are dealing with right now with regard to Trump, and is he an outlier as a Republican, right? Or is this a new normal, right? In the Republican Party that, and we don't know the answer to that question until the next Republican president is elected, right? Really. But this question, I think, gets at, are we seeing, you know, more Republicans being more conspiratorial now than we would expect, or more conspiratorial than Democrats? Is it because we have the most conspiratorial president that we've ever had, and he happens to be at least in name a Republican, or is this some sort of trend? I mean, I tend to think it's more of an outlier, because I don't think the psychology here would say that this is a sort of a trend going forward. But that's about the psychology. That's not about the politics, right? Right. I'll stay on the psychology part of that.
I want to get in one last question here. Well, we just have a few minutes left. This one's from Lorraine, asking, do we need to start a critical thinking in media program in schools, and maybe even as part of public health programs? And I think that may already exist in some places, but I'm curious to the extent people are aware of this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that high schools are certainly many of them are doing media literacy classes, doing critical thinking. I think that the other piece of this is making sure people understand the nature of science and the nature of scientific knowledge. As we talk about certainty here, and someone mentioned, well, why can we provide more certainty for people? The problem with that is that scientific knowledge does change, and it adapts, and we've seen it over COVID-19, right? We saw first scientists, doctors saying that masks weren't necessary, and that was a consensus. And now the consensus has shifted as more is learned about the virus. And people are seeing in that shift a conspiracy theory, right? They're saying, why? They said we shouldn't be wearing masks. Now they're saying we should be wearing masks. They must be trying to control us. But the reality is, when something new and a surprising event happens and we're learning about it, whether it's a bombing, for example, and every media organization is out there trying to get the answer quickly, right? And people are getting quoted quickly about, this is what we think is happening. Oh, now we're learning more. And now we're learning more. And that evolves. And we have to be comfortable with that and know that right now the prevailing expertise is X, right? And follow that, but recognize that if the prevailing consensus of that expertise shifts, it's not because of some deep state or some conspiracy to control us. It's that the science has evolved.
That's, I think, yeah, I'm sorry, Kareem, did you have a?
Yeah, and if I can add to that, I second what Joanne was saying in regards to, scientific inquiry and the methodology behind scientific thinking, because it helped. Because I've seen some interviews with QAnon supporters, and when the reporter asks them, there's no proof that Q exists, the answer that probably many of you may have heard, they instantly say, but there's no proof that he doesn't exist either, right? And this is antithetical to scientific thinking and scientific inquiry, right? Which also reminds me of, and I think in the chat earlier, somebody mentioned, used the term combating conspiracy theory belief, and that, given my research on extremism and extremist thought and counter extremism, we are not necessarily, and I'm talking about the media side of things, we're not necessarily seeking to convert them, because once they have certain beliefs and and views on things, they are actually strong, and it's very hard to change that if there's not an urge from the inside to do it. So what we're doing instead is trying to mitigate that in the sense of, you know, putting facts and discussing things in a more, you know, leaning on experts, etc., in order to propagate facts and project ideas and stuff like that. And something that very interesting that I saw on BBC actually not so long ago, not all conspiracy theory supporters would dismiss it by saying, okay, prove to me that it doesn't exist, right? Which is technically impossible. However, some of them are actually willing to discuss. So what BBC did, they got a professor and they got a conspiracy theory supporter of many actually conspiracy theories, and they sat together and they have a very meaningful conversation that you can just Google and find on YouTube. So such conversations can be very interesting. And in the context of extremism as well, I know that one of the things that I've worked in the past is actually leaning on defectors. So once somebody is, you know, a part of a certain group or something, and they've changed their views, once they come and talk about it, they are being deemed as experts because they've been through it. So that helps as well, rather than dismissing the situation or saying something like what Joanne was saying earlier, conspiracy theorists or lunatics or, you know, weirdos, etc. So.
I think that's a great place to wrap this up. I want to be respectful of our panelists' time, but I want to thank everyone for participating in this. Thanks to the audience for tuning in. Thank you to Joe and Joanne and Kareem and Kimberly for your really wonderful comments today. And also thank you to Aaron Dietrich and DU's Alumni Services for helping put this all together. I wanted to let you know we have been recording this. A recording of this should be publicly available hopefully by the middle of next week. We'll post it on the Center on American Politics website and send it, announce that on social media. Otherwise, thank you all for participating today, and everyone stay safe and have a great week. Take care.